As all members have received a copy of the call of tonight's meeting, the reading of the call will be omitted. At this point, I would like to call upon Alexandra Small and Samantha Salkin to lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance. So will everyone please rise?
Okay, ready? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you very much. Many of you may know it is a tradition now in September to welcome to our meeting the participants in the American Legion's Boys and Girls State Program. And at this point, I call upon Irv Porter of District 6 to discuss that program and Greenwich's experience this year. Mr. Porter.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. This is again a pleasure and an honor to introduce this year's Boys and Girls State delegation from Greenwich, and we've got a little special event for you at the end of the introductions. I'm proud to be with Livy Florin, who's the co-chair of the Boys and Girls State Commission. And first, I'd like to have anybody in the RTM or any guests that were attendees at Boys or Girls State, please stand up, and I'm going to embarrass you because I've got names to start with. Among you should be Steve Walco, Jenny Krob, Greg Fruman, Dean Goss. Come on, Dean, stand tall, baby. You're the dean. Steve Meskers, Dave Deitchen, Danny Farneraz, and Doug Wells. Okay? You told me. Stand up, Doug. Anybody else I missed? Thank you. Livy and I are also products of the program. These programs are the creation of American Legion and the American Legion Auxiliary and go back to 1934. On behalf of the Legion, it gives me great pleasure to introduce to you the commander of Post 29, Chris Hughes. Please stand, Chris. Chris is with us tonight, and we want to make sure that you say thank you to the Legion and thank you to Post 29 for being the great sponsor that you've been over the years. And in addition to the Legion, there are a number of individual organizations, civic-minded organizations, and individuals that have contributed on the financial side that allow this program to continue to live. Now, my pleasure to introduce the Greenwich Boys State contingent for 2003. Matt Baptist is not here. Zachary James, Guillermo Perez. A word about Guillermo. Guillermo is the current Greenwich High School student body president. In addition, he was chosen by Boys State as the outstanding contributor to the Boys State, that's Connecticut Boys State Senate. And Tom Marisso, who is from Brunswick, and Tom has a special award that he's been given. You may notice the name, that he was one of the Brunswick students that was chosen as a national semifinalist in the National Merit Scholarship Program. This is an outstanding group of young men. On the girls' side, Heather DeCino, Ann Walker, Fiona Young. Fiona is one of the 17 Greenwich High School students that was also chosen as a National Merit semifinalist. Alexandra Small and Samantha Salkin. Each year, Boys and Girls State, and there are 50 programs that are run across the country, choose 2 young people to represent their state to go to Girls or Boys Nation. This year, uniquely, Alexandra and Sammy were the 2 girls chosen by the state to represent the state. And they represented us well, and they brought back for you and for the rest of Greenwich a little slideshow that they've put together, And in about 3 minutes, they'll highlight the experiences that they had at Girls Nation. Ladies? Now, ready? Watch this. Watch this. You've got new chairs to sit in. We got a multimedia center now. Ladies, be careful. Here we come.
Good evening, everybody, and thank you for having us here tonight. We're honored to be able to speak with you and share our experiences at Girls Nation. We had an amazing experience, and we're really excited to be here and to get to share our pictures and tell you a little bit about it. And we appreciate the Legion for sponsoring us to attend this program. Thank you.
While at Girls Nation, we were fortunate enough to have many enjoyable day trips. Our first journey was to Arlington National Cemetery, where the evidence of the cost of freedom surrounded us. While at the cemetery, we witnessed the changing of the guards at the tomb of the unknown soldier, and the Girls Nation family also got to lay a wreath of poppies at the foot of the tomb of the unknown soldier.
We were also fortunate enough to be able to visit the Walter Reed Memorial Medical Center and speak with some wounded warriors who have sustained severe injuries while serving our country. And it was amazing to speak to them and to see that these young men and women who were but a few years older than ourselves had suffered so much, yet were still so proud of the service that they had given to our country.
At Laurel Girls State in Connecticut, Senator Blumenthal stated that democracy is not a spectator sport, and we were able to observe this firsthand as we accompanied Senator Blumenthal and Senator Murphy along their daily journey. Our day began with a photo op with Senator Blumenthal, and then we accompanied him to 3 separate committee meetings that he was scheduled to attend that morning. We attended the quorum call in the Judiciary Committee, watched presidential nominees being interviewed for prominent military positions in the Armed Services Committee, and listened to debate over improving cellular connections in rural areas in the Commerce Committee. Following our meeting with Senator Blumenthal, we had a meeting with Senator Murphy. Our meeting initially began in his office, and then he asked us to accompany him to the Senate. After taking the underground tram with the senator escorted us to a special viewing gallery where we watched him present an amendment that encouraged businesses to use American labor. After spending the day with our senators, we have a newfound appreciation for what our public service agents do on a daily basis to promote the common good of their constituents.
On the final day of our trip, we were fortunate enough to be able to visit the White House. After touring the East Wing, we were able to have an audience with the president himself.
So to thank Mr. Porter and Representative Florin for providing us with this excellent opportunity, and Moderator Byrne for teaching us about parliamentary procedure, we would like to present you guys with flowers.
Okay. These are for you, Tom.
That was an excellent presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, ladies.
Thank you.
How about a standing O? How about a standing O?
Well, Mr. Porter and Representative Florin, you outdid yourselves this year. Gentlemen, ladies, on behalf of the RTM, we thank you. That was an unbelievable presentation. Thank you for representing the town so well. And again, what an excellent presentation. Thank you. Only the latest technology here in the Greenwich schools. All right. Welcome to the September meeting of the Greenwich Representative Town Meeting. My name is Tom Byrne, RTM moderator. As all members have received a copy of the minutes of our June 10 meeting, the reading of those minutes will be omitted. I do have a change to be made to the attendance. District 3, I guess it was District 4 reported there was an error in the card that was submitted. So we will mark the number present as 163, making only 66 absent, and removing the names of Ms. Parnell, Tam, and Mr. Tuthill, who were present for that meeting. Are there any other suggested changes to the proposed minutes? Hearing none and absent objection, the amended minutes stand adopted upon unanimous consent. All right, that now brings us to the call for tonight's meeting. I informed our committee and district chairs that based on the reports received, I will recommend shortly, I will recommend now and shortly designate 2 items for our consent calendar, with the remaining items to be considered separately. The items that I will shortly put on the consent calendar are items 3 and 5. And if they remain there, we will hear no committee reports and have no discussion on those items, leaving to be considered separately items 1, 2, 4, 6, and 7. So at this time, I will, pursuant to our rules, designate the following 2 items for our consent calendar. The first is item 3, the appointment of Peter Levy to be a member of the Planning and Zoning Commission for a term expiring March 31, 2014. And the second item for the consent calendar is item number 5, and that is the appointment of Leslie Moriarty to be a member of the Greenwich High School Music Instructional Space and Auditorium Building Committee. And that's for the life of that committee. All right, those 2 items now are on our consent calendar. Is there any objection to either of those being designated for our consent calendar? Hearing none, I ask our district chairs to please mark your voting cards, consent calendar items 3 and 5, and proceed to poll your delegation. While we are voting, we will continue with the business of the meeting, and we will proceed through the remaining items in numerical order. That brings item number 1 before us. May we have the resolution on that? Al Cava, Director of Labor Relations.
Good evening, Mr. Moderator, members of town meeting. Item 1, resolve that the representative town meeting, in exercising its authority pursuant to Connecticut General Statutes, Section 7474B, hereby approves the funds necessary to implement the terms of the Town Local 1042 IAFF Collective Bargaining Agreement, covering fiscal 12-13 in the amount of $44,061 and fiscal 13-14 in amount of $93,408. In addition thereto, the representative town meeting approves the funds necessary to implement the terms of the Town Local 1042 IAFF Collective Bargaining Agreement covering the period fiscal 14-15, subject to the budgetary process as prescribed in the town charter. Be it further resolved that the representative town meeting approves any terms of such agreement which may be in conflict with town charter, special act, ordinance, rule, or regulation adopted by the municipal employer or its agents of the town. Thank you.
Thank you. Will a member please move the adoption of the resolution? The resolution on item 1 has been moved and seconded. May we hear the reports of the committees that considered this, beginning with the report of our Labor Contracts Committee and its chair, David Detchen.
Mr. Moderator, fellow members of the RTM, your Labor Contracts Committee met on 26 August 2013. After extensive discussions with the town's labor negotiator, Al Cava, the committee voted 5-0-0 to recommend that the RTM approve the collective bargaining agreement negotiated with Local 1042, to cover the period retroactively from 1 July 2012 to 30 June 2015. From the town's perspective, two major goals were achieved in these negotiations. First, the establishment of a Tier 2 pension structure for firefighters hired after 1 October 2013 that is very similar to the Tier 2 that was established in the last contract negotiations with the Policemen's Union. Second, there was a further extension of the high-deductible HSA healthcare program to the Firefighters Union to include the $2,000, $4,000 deductibles and prescription copays. Let me discuss the retirement plan changes first. The introduction of this two-tier retirement benefit structure will result in longer-term savings for the town. Thus, with our current plan, costs of the plan are about 15.5% of payroll. The cost of the new Tier 2 plan for those new hires who are hired after 1 October will be somewhere between 11.3% and 13.5% of payroll, depending on whether the new plan induces these firemen to defer retirement, which is indeed the goal of the plan. Although the cost savings of the plan are intended to have a major impact in the longer term, in fact, no fewer than 6 new firefighters will be hired after 1 October, so that we will see a cost impact of the Tier 2 structure even to some degree in the shorter term. In this connection, I point out that the long-term savings impact may occur sooner than one might expect. For example, of the 800 or so civilian employees who are now in collective bargaining units, which have adopted the defined contribution plan, which has been in effect since 2005, even though incumbent employees at that time were grandfathered and remained in the defined benefit plan, through retirements and departures over the last 8 years, there have already been 350 out of the 800 new hires that are now within the defined contribution plan. Let's turn to the health insurance. In regard to the extension of the high deductible health savings accounts to the firefighters, you will note that the settlement cost summary in the explanos reflects the fact that if we were to be charged the same premiums in 2014 and 2015 as was the case in 2012 and 2013, we would have a cumulative savings in healthcare costs with this particular collective bargaining unit of over 14%. Please note, however, that this settlement cost summary is an artificial construct. It allows us on the Labor Contracts Committee, and it allows you in the RTM, to see what percentage of cost savings the town labor negotiator has been able to achieve over the current status quo, on the assumption that the premiums, the healthcare premiums, would remain the same. But be aware, however, that the overall cost of the contract, in terms of the impact on the town's budget, is also influenced by a factor that cannot be negotiated in the negotiations with the various unions. Specifically, neither the town negotiator nor the unions have any control over the premium increases imposed on the town by whoever is the town's current health insurance carrier. As it is, the town is anticipating something like a 15% increase in health care premiums as of 1 January 2014, and a further 12% increase on 1 January 2015. As a result, the estimated medical insurance costs to the town for firefighters are likely to be around $4.633 million in 2014-2015. However, if the changes in the health care benefits had not been negotiated by the town with the firefighters, the health care costs for firefighters would have been even higher, namely an estimated $5.272 million. Thus, the negotiated health care insurance plan changes may save us something like $635,000 in 2014-2015 if the insurance premium increases are about what we anticipate. In order to gain these short-term and long-term cost savings in health care costs and pension costs, the town was not in a position to be overly aggressive in the GWI, in other words, the salary wage negotiations. Thus, the GWI over the 3 years of this contract are a declining 2.65% in the first year, 2.6% in the second year, and 2.5% in the third year. Although there are step increases, these step increases are not a significant cost factor in and of themselves, resulting in total payroll net increases of 0.32%, 0.39%, and 0.17% respectively over the 3 years. In any event, these GWIs are in line with other wage increases for firefighters in Connecticut. Thus, most GWIs for firefighters for 2012, 2013, and 2013-2014 within Connecticut are in the range of 2.0 to 2.75% in the first year, and between 2.5 and 3% in the third year, 2014-2015, with average settlements over the 3 years of 1.94%, 2.2%, and 2.68% respectively. Thus, our negotiated GWI for 2014-2015 is actually below the current average of settlements for that year. In addition, looking at the wage minimums and maximums for various ranks of firefighters in towns in Fairfield County with over 20,000 population, most of Greenwich's officers tend to be ranked in the top third, but not at the very top, while those at the rank of captain and firefighter are in fact in the middle of the pack. In the end, your Labor Contracts Committee concluded that even though the GWI for 2012-13 and 2013-14 are higher than the overall average in Connecticut, they are within the range of settlements and were justified by the long-term and short-term savings the town achieved in regard to pension and health care costs. Now, looking forward, your Labor Contracts Committee has already begun discussing with the town negotiator the fact that in light of the massive changes in national health care structure anticipated to be implemented through the Affordable Care Act in the next few years, including the so-called Cadillac tax, the town should consider whether it needs to implement a very substantial restructuring of its whole health care insurance system. It may well be that nibbling around the edges with issues such as increases in deductibles and increased employee cost sharing will not get the premiums low enough in order for us to avoid the Cadillac tax. Likewise, we have raised with the town negotiator the issue of retiree medical insurance benefits. However, I should point out that many of these health care restructuring issues will be the subject of collective bargaining. We will not be able to impose them unilaterally, which means that implementing such a restructuring may not be easy, and it may result in concessions by the town in other areas of negotiation within the collective bargaining agreements. Thus, we on the Labor Contracts Committee anticipate that in the long term, there may need to be an extensive discussion of negotiating priorities in the upcoming cycle of labor negotiations. Thank you.
Thank you. Gordon Ennis, Chair of our Finance Committee.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Finance Committee met on September 9th at 7:30 p.m. in the Town Hall Lounge and adjourned at 9:44. The discussion on this item involved the two primary objectives that were set out by Mr. Cava, simply to make and achieve appropriate changes in the pension plan and in the health plan. As a consequence, the GWI increase is perhaps higher than we would like, but we traded that for the concessions that were just articulated by Mr. Detchen. The Finance Committee voted 10, 1, and 1. District 7 voted no. The delegate decided that the negotiated result was adequate, but not the best we could do. District 6 was present for the meeting, but not present for the vote, because that delegate was involved in item 4 with the legislative and rules. Thank you.
Thank you. John Harkins, Chair of our Town Services Committee.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator, fellow members of the RTM, and guests. Good evening. Your Town Services Committee met on September 10th to review item 1, the firefighters' contract with Mr. Cava of the town's personnel department. The details of this presentation and some sample questions from our members are given below. Our vote was 11-0-0. The presentation by Mr. Cava was fully informative, and he answered our questions to our satisfaction. The issues that we discussed, that we touched on, the key points, of course, in Mr. Cava's presentation were the pensions, the health care, and the general wage increase. Our questions centered around the practicality of towns having a pact among themselves to have comparable contracts so that we could compare the results and so that we would not be paying more than necessary. Mr. Cava explained the reasons that was an impractical solution. We talked about the rising cost of contracts versus the tax revenue and mill rate. There's no easy solution to that. So much relies on the work of Mr. Detchen's group. We also talked about the impact of the Affordable Care Act. We talked about the Greenwich benefits versus those in New York State, our neighbors to the west, excuse me. I better get my directions straight. We talked about the build-up year, which is year 19 now instead of year 20 for retirement payment. That's the year that pension payments are derived from. We talked about sick time. It's being managed better than ever before. The decrease in the number of fires is due to the prevalent use of smoke alarms and other means. And in time, we also talked about the shifts and fire watch and volunteers. And thank you very much. Appreciate your time.
Thank you. Before I open this item up for discussion, I have the vote on the consent calendar items 3 and 5. Those in favor, 175, opposed 5, abstaining 2. The consent calendar items have carried. I also note that there are sign-up sheets, one in front here and one on the table as you enter the auditorium for item 4, if anyone is interested to put their name on that speaker sign-up list. All right, discussion on item 1. Lucia Jansen, District 7. To be followed by Don Hamilton.
Good evening. My name is Lucia Jansen. I am the District 7 delegate for the Budget Overview Committee. I am also a longtime RTM member, now in my 8th year. During my tenure, the town's labor cost increases have far exceeded both the rate of inflation and the town BET budget guidelines. Based on simple math, these annual labor cost increases are incompatible with the town's stated policy to have low and predictable tax increases. So assuming we all like low and predictable taxes, why are we not fixing this? Here is what we are told. We can't push for more reforms with these labor contracts because we are afraid we will lose at possible arbitration. Has that historically been the case? Yes. Is it true today? No, it is not. But getting results does require firm leadership and the will to change. Let me cite 2 quick examples of such leadership. First, in March 2012, the town of Westport prevailed on winning 16 of 17 very significant concessions in a major arbitration dispute with their own Department of Public Works. Above all, Westport won the ability to convert those employees from the expensive and highly risky defined benefit plan to the defined contribution plan. Second, this time with no arbitration, the town of Ridgefield, Connecticut, the first selectman and the HR director, last year negotiated in one contract the conversion of all new police union employees to the defined contribution plan, as well as full replacement of the existing health plan to the lower cost HSA, and many other material terms similar to Westport. All this has been said to be outside reach for us in one contract by our town leadership. Now, before I hear the "but Greenwich is so different" slogan, let me share with you that both the town of Ridgefield and Westport are wealthy Fairfield County towns like Greenwich. In fact, both towns have higher median family incomes than Greenwich. I may not be able to change your mind on this contract, but I would like you to consider this going forward. Left unchecked, these contracts will lead to significant tax hikes and likely reductions of other essential town services as high labor costs crowd out other expenses. We need to stop thinking that only one or two items in a contract are worth negotiating, and we need leadership that is not afraid to go to arbitration when it is the right thing to do for the town's long-term fiscal health. Thank you.
Further discussion on item 1? Don Hamilton, District 7.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. My fellow delegates, guests, invited and uninvited. I'm going to take a slightly different tack from my esteemed colleague, Lucia Jansen, and talk about the direction and the future of our labor contracts, specifically highlighting the urgency that I think we need to take toward removing defined benefit plans entirely. So I rise tonight really for two reasons. The first is to congratulate our labor relations team for their tireless and thoughtful efforts and for the genuine successes in improving our union contracts. Special kudos to the BOC and especially Lucia for highlighting long-term hotspots and the value of earlier, more transparent, and fuller disclosures. I want to discuss the reasons we should redouble our efforts to phase out defined benefit plans for our public safety employees. And I will conclude with a comment on our pension fund management, a subject a little dearer to my heart and closer to my avocation. The guarantee of a fixed inflation-adjusted payment for life juxtaposed with new challenges for the group management style of heavily regulated pension funds, which include the likelihood of long-lived variations in investment returns, will continue to result in a major mismatch favoring obligations. Since 2004, cumulative underfunding in every year will total $115 million by the end of 2014, every year. Age creep is an acute problem in public safety, both in health care, where the long-term impact of HSAs is largely unknown, and in pensions, where any outlier contract concession further amplifies the mismatch. Total benefits are rising across all departments and rising as a percent of salaries and department cost to a current 43% and 20% respectively. That's 43% of department cost and salaries and 20% of total department cost. For public safety, benefits were 76 and 80% of salaries, that's fire and police or police and fire, and 50% of total departmental cost. Defined benefit cost alone for public safety were 38% of the town's total defined benefit cost, while salaries were 15%. Defined benefit annual town funding is, as Mr. Detchen mentioned, at least in retrospect, 15.5% versus 5% for defined contribution plans, and employee contributions for defined contribution and DB plans are both 5%. We, that is me, are still gathering data to construct a present value comparison for the next 30 to 35 years. That's a range of life plans. That's a range of life for plans in retirement for public safety. And that's the unusual characteristic of these contracts. Because of contract terms, GWI, employee contribution, final year add-ons, and especially an ever-increasing life expectancy, the comparison with a defined contribution plan for the same employee will be dramatic. We also learned that no such comparison exists today in the town of Greenwich, so we're not alone. We appreciate the many and real obstacles peculiar to public safety from a shift to defined contribution. But several towns in Connecticut, as Lucia pointed out, have done so recently, and most every community in the country is or will be moving in this direction. Critically, a handful of states have modified the criteria for arbitration to improve negotiating outcomes for local governments. Connecticut, no surprise, has not. We applaud the Labor Contracts Committee in Alcaba, and certainly the public safety unions as well, to modify our contracts to lessen our financial burden without sacrificing the quality and loyalty of these important public servants who go far to make Greenwich a special place to live and to work. However, it is somewhat counterproductive and misguided, in my opinion, for the BET to argue that the defined benefit funding problem, no argument that $23 to $25 million a year going out the door is not a problem, are largely laid on the doorsteps of our pension fund underperformance. They should be considered separately, if not equally. Our obligations are fixed and escalating. Our investment returns are unsatisfactory, in part because of state regulations and internal constraints preventing us from developing more flexible and timely investing strategies. As a co-founder of a 15-year-old performance-driven partnership, a little-known fact in this room, I'm sure, for a good reason, I appreciate just how tough it is to achieve consistently high returns in the most volatile public equity and debt markets in my memory. It is even more difficult in a small group democracy without a lightning rod leader. And I think that situation, that condition exists today in our pension fund board. To conclude, please do not underestimate the enduring power of fixed liabilities over longer and longer time spans. Abolish defined benefit plans. Thank you.
Further discussion on item 1. Mr. Tuthill, District 4.
I move that further discussion this evening be limited to 3 minutes per speaker per motion.
You're talking about not just on this item, but for the balance of the evening. All right. We are going to dispose of item 1, and then I will come back to you for that motion. Further discussion on item 1. Will the district chairs please mark your voting cards, item number 1, and proceed to poll your delegation. Mr. Tuthill, please come forward.
Mr. Moderator, I move that all discussion be limited to 3 minutes per speaker per motion for the rest of this meeting. Thank you.
Mr. Moderator.
Is there a second? All right, it has been moved and seconded to limit debate for the balance of the meeting by giving each speaker 3 minutes per motion per item. Mr. Von Keyserling, what is your point of order?
Mr. Moderator, I believe this is an action of abuse of parliamentary procedure to muzzle the body. We need discussions. We only have 1 or 2 major items on there. We are not heavily loaded tonight.
Mr.
There is
Von
no reason
Geyseling,
for this.
I've heard your point of order, and I will rule that your point of order is not well taken. A motion to limit debate is a valid parliamentary device. All right, there is a difference between a motion to limit debate procedurally that is directed just to a single item and one directed for the balance of a meeting. And that difference is that this motion is debatable. So Mr. Tuthill's motion has been moved and seconded. It is now before the body. Discussion on the motion to limit debate. Now, I will add that you may think there's nothing more ridiculous than debating a motion to limit debate, but that is the designation of this particular form of the motion. Discussion on Mr. Tuthill's motion to limit debate. Mr. Von Geyseling.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Perhaps this is the moment then to elucidate the thinking on this. There has been often times when we had heavy agendas, we have lots to discuss, and there is the fear that people will go on and on because of the popularity of the topic or the discussion. In this case, I believe there's only one item before us that is anyway controversial. We have nothing else really on the agenda that should prove that controversial. I think that this is an abuse of the limiting of debate simply for people who are not that interested and want to get home quickly and not do the business of our government, which is to hear the public speak. We have a lot of people from the public here who may wish to speak. I think they should be invited to and should be heard from them. After all, they are a constituency. We also should speak among ourselves on these topics that have great importance in policy. And I think
Mr. Von Geyseling.
I think, Mr. Moderator, that proves the point of the seriousness of this body on a matter of this nature.
Further discussion on Mr. Tuthill's motion to limit debate. Mary Ferry, District 5.
Mr. Moderator, normally these motions include 10 minutes or so for the major proponent and the major opponent. This does not include that.
No, what you are referring to really arose at our budget meeting to protect the surprise motion to reduce or delete. That I think Mr. Tuthill is not anticipating a similar type issue. This is no one should be taken by surprise here by any motion that might be made. Is that a fair statement, Mr. Tuthill? Yes, sir. Mr. Tuthill concurs.
Does that mean
there is quite a difference between a meeting, non-budget meeting, and our budget meeting.
Does this mean that the chief proponent has only 3 minutes?
Yes, unless it's a committee report. This motion does not limit committee reports.
I think we should change it.
Okay. All good points. Dr. Carlson. District 1. If anyone else intends to speak, I ask that you come forward.
Mr. Moderator, members of the RTM, I support Mr. Tuthill's motion to limit debate. I think sometimes we need to protect the body from some overzealous people. The items we're going to face tonight have had a good deal of discussion, and I think what it'll boil down to in the end about whether it's just knocked off or if it's sent back to a committee, perhaps legislative rules. But I mean, we had a discussion of this problem earlier, and I really found that that meeting was not one of the most satisfactory that we've had, and I think it'd be very much in line with improving matters for the average person in the body if we support Mr. Tuthill's motion and we limit debate to 3 minutes.
You see, Mr. Tuthill, if you had waited until item 4 came, there would be no debate on your motion. So, further debate on the motion to limit debate. Yes, sir.
Thank you. I'm rather new around here, so I'm a little puzzled by a motion without any support, except we should keep things short. It would seem, though, that a motion at this point would be appropriate to limit debate for all meetings to 3 minutes, because I can't see a difference between this and others.
Further discussion on the motion to limit debate? All right, this being a procedural motion, I will call for a voice vote in the first instance. The motion to limit debate requires a 2/3 majority to pass. And I remind those present in the hall that only RTM members may participate in voting. All right? So, if you are in favor of limiting all speakers from here on to 3 minutes per motion per item, you should vote yes when I call for the vote. If you are opposed to that, you should vote no. All those in favor of Mr. Tuthill's motion to limit debate, please signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? No. That motion is carried. Item number 2 now comes before us. Mr. von Keisling, for what purpose do you rise? Will the district chairs please mark your voting cards? Tuthill, motion to limit debate. And let us please expedite that voting. We will continue with the meeting. If we get to a period of discussion, we will need to await the result of that vote. So once again, the district chairs, mark your voting cards. Tuthill, motion to limit debate for the balance of the evening. If you are in favor of that 3-minute limit, you check yes. If you are opposed, you check no. All right, item number 2 now comes before us. David Tice, our selectman, with that resolution.
Good evening, Mr. Moderator, ladies and gentlemen of the RTM. Resolved that the following named person nominated by the Board of Selectmen be appointed a member of the Inland Wetlands Watercourse Agency for a term expiring 3/31/17, Scott A. Salisbury.
Thank you. Will the member please move the adoption of the resolution? Resolution on item 2 has been moved and seconded. May we have the reports of the committees that considered this, beginning with Peter Berg, Chair of our Land Use Committee.
Evening, Mr. Moderator, fellow members. Mr. Salisbury was unable to attend the Land Use Committee meeting last week. The Land Use Committee voted to postpone this item until our October meeting. So at the appropriate time, if perhaps that's now?
No.
No.
No, it isn't. Say thank you. Sit down. Next report.
Thank you.
All right, I'm sorry. I'm sorry, Mr. Berg. Could you repeat that?
Yes, Mr. Salisbury was unable to attend the Land Use Committee meeting, and the Land Use Committee meeting voted to postpone the item. So at the appropriate time.
Thank you. Mr. von Keisling with the report of our Appointments Committee.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. The Appointments Committee met with Mr. Salisbury this evening at 7:30. The vote was 11 in favor, no abstentions, no negatives. District 2 is absent. Mr. Salisbury has served well as an alternate over the last year or so, year and a half. He has attended a lot of training. Interestingly enough, he said the course that he finally took on this is equivalent to the certification required for an employee or director of an inland wetlands agency, which gave us comfort in the sense that the inland wetlands members are, how should I say, facile and able with the rules and intricacies of the agency's regulations. He has attended, although he's an alternate, he has attended almost all of the meetings, if not all of the meetings, since his appointment. He has been very, how should I say, dedicated to this, and we are very approving of his nomination and appointment. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Berg?
So once again, because Mr. Salisbury was unable to attend the Land Use Committee meeting, we proposed to postpone this item until our October meeting.
Thank you. That motion to postpone being offered on behalf of one of our committees does not require a second and is now currently before us. Discussion on the motion to postpone. All right, again, this being procedural, I will call for a voice vote. If you are in favor of postponing item 2 to our October 28 meeting, you vote yes. If you are opposed and want to proceed tonight, you vote no. All those in favor of the Land Use Committee motion to postpone item 2 to our October meeting, please signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? No. That motion has carried. Let's see, item 4 now comes before us. May we have the resolution on that item? I believe that is being presented by Irv Porter, who was chairman of the subcommittee that was set up by our Legislative and Rules and Finance Committees to study the lease issue. Irv Porter. Mr. Porter, let me just announce, I do have the result of the vote on item number 1, which is the firefighter contract. Those in favor, 126, opposed, 56, abstaining, 5. That item is carried. Mr. Porter.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. I just checked with the chairman of Legislative and Rules since they met tonight to see if there were any changes in what you have on the call. There are none, and therefore the motion, or the item 4, is as it is presented on the call. Now, my name is Irv Porter. I'm District 6.
All right, so why don't we procedurally get this in front of us? This is now being offered on behalf of Legislative and Rules, correct?
This is being offered on behalf of Legislative and Rules.
All
Yes,
right,
sir.
and being that it is offered on behalf of one of our committees, it does not require a second. It is now currently before us in the form that you find in the call. Committee reports, beginning with the subcommittee report. Mr. Porter. Mr. Von Keyserling? Well, I'll answer questions, Mr. Porter. I don't know, but it is currently before us. Mr. Porter? It is in legal order. It is now before us. Mr. Porter?
And the answer to his question is because I was asked to.
Mr. Von Keyserling, your disregard of our rules of civility and order is upsetting to the body. I ask that you only speak when recognized, and you are not recognized. Mr. Porter. You know, my wife was right. I should have taken an Advil. Mr. Porter. Mr. Porter. Yes, please state your point of order.
I asked that to you, to the town attorney, whether this presentation is in order, whether it should be going through legislative.
Any member may present an item to us. And Mr. Porter is a member of the RTM. And is there a second to this? It has been moved and seconded. It is now before us. Mr. Porter.
Are you sure? My name is Irv Porter. It's still Irv Porter. I'm from District 6, Old Greenwich. I've been the Finance Committee Chair or co-vice chair for the past 4 years. As the chair of the Joint Subcommittee, I have the privilege tonight and the honor to present item 4 to you. As a matter of full disclosure, relative to item 4, since moving to Old Greenwich in 1974, my volunteer activities have included a very long list of community involvement. And given that, I want you to know that I came forward and requested the opportunity to be chair of this committee because of the experiences that I've had. In OGRCC, I've coached sports over a period of 20 years. I founded...
Mr. Porter, can we have the committee report, please?
Yes, you may. All I'm trying to say...
You may, if you would like to speak on this, I will recognize you.
I see what you're saying. Okay, fine, thank you. I'm proud to have the opportunity to present the work product that the Joint Subcommittee prepared at your request. This all started, as you may remember, with the Town Arts Council lease. When it came to the RTM for approval, there were a number of shortcomings in the lease, including the terms and conditions of subleasing. That started the process of RTM's oversight of all leases, which led to the comprehensive report, which led to increased awareness on leasing everywhere. Fast forward to the RTM address of the Mianus River Boat Club lease, famous item 7, and referral that item to the Finance and Legislative and Rules Committee, which led to the formation of the Joint Subcommittee. That's the background. The progress that we've made to date. Our initial task was to review the Mianus River Boat Club lease. We quickly recognized that with no lease policy, we couldn't address the lease. We developed a mission statement, a scope, communicated regularly with the first selectman, the town administrator, and the town attorney. All parties knew that the disposition of the lease, of any lease, started with the Board of Selectmen and the Law Department. The Finance Committee had previously searched the inventory for all leases, attempted to determine who administered the leases that were approved and who negotiated new or renewal leases. It was clear to all of us that it was a combination of the Board of Selectmen and departments and the Law Department. Was there a defined policy? No. Were there defined standards of review for the RTM? No. Those were the two key reasons that the RTM initiatives that triggered the Joint Subcommittee in the first place. Early in the process, I think our collaborative efforts in communicating with the Board of Selectmen, the department heads, and the first selectman certainly helped promote the development of a lease policy and a description of the leasing procedure, which the Board of Selectmen formally passed in March of 2012. Today, when asked, the First Selectman Office will advise you that the inventory of all leases is the responsibility of the Law Department. And the negotiation of leases, whether they're new or renewal, is the responsibility of the Board of Selectmen. Snapshot today. So even with the establishment of the Board of Selectmen lease policy and process description, we continued our efforts, and with collaboration with the people that I spoke of earlier, we decided very simply to focus on policy guidelines on behalf of the RTM, which we did. The work product is item 4. This work product was unanimously endorsed and determined to be in proper legal order in June. Could it be fine-tuned? Could it be simplified? Yes, in my judgment. As we presented our lease policy guidelines to the 4 standing committees this past week, we listened and we learned. At district meetings, we listened and we learned. Had the Joint Subcommittee considered the complexity of the lease policy guidelines? Yes. Could they have been simplified? Yes. But even if simplified, we clearly would have found it to be of paramount importance that the leasee or the potential leasee clearly demonstrate the benefits of the lease to the town and also demonstrate their performance against their lease responsibilities. This is particularly important, I think you would agree, for renewals. As the chief proponent, I suggest to you that you'll have 2 choices tonight: to vote item 4 up or down. If you believe that's the best course, I suggest that if the item is approved as is, there will be some unhappy folks among the 43 groups that have a lease. Those who believe that the vote should be against know that emotion is stronger than logic, and also know that this is an election year. The lease policy guidelines will be placed as proposed in the addendum as a reference guide. If you're responsible for leases, which we all are because we have to vote for approval or disapproval, and you do your homework and you consider all the factors in the disposition of town property, you will take the time to tune in and tune up and read the addendum. If the lease is up for renewal or a new lease is being considered, we think that you gave us the responsibility to require the leaseholder to explain the public benefits. In the case of a commercial lease, example, the plaza, if the benefits of that lease would require testing the market at the time of renewal, if income for the town is the prevailing benefit, in addition to making sure that Greenwich is an attractive place to live and work, you'd fully have to consider that. If you vote against item 4, you're trusting that the existing Board of Selectmen policy process and that the RTM review process that we currently have in place will be adequate, and that the oversight and advice that you would get from the Finance Committee, Legislative and Rules, and any other standing committees that are responsible for evaluating a lease would be appropriate, would be enough. But you won't have the benefit of lease policy guidelines, which some have suggested should be simplified and relabeled RTM standards for review. I'm not going to list the controversial issues for you. You've got plenty of people here who will identify those and bring them before. I trust that during debate on the merits of the lease policy guidelines, that the joint subcommittee members will be available to explain the words that we chose, why they were considered, often debated, and chosen probably in the eyes of some with a little bit more of a business/legal interpretation than guided by a moral compass that basically has preserved these leases in some cases for over 70 years. So for an emotionally charged subject like this that suggests there's going to be a change from the status quo, the opponents are likely to ask you, who will be the umpires or referees, to call a foul or a violation of the status quo if the policy guidelines make them uncomfortable or they believe they're unfair. I will tell you, I don't think that we've missed any of these controversial issues. Instead, I'll say what I said again at the start. I'm proud to have served on the Joint Subcommittee, and especially proud that this group of 7 people could address such a complicated and controversial issue, put aside their personal biases, and develop a set of policy guidelines that are a true test of what the RTM should be thinking about when it addresses approval or disapproval of new or renewal leases. We stand at the ready to itemize our responses when we get into the debate. Thank you.
All right, let me do 2 things. First, remind those here that the limit on debate applies to individual speakers, not to committee reports. Number 2, we do have the result of the vote on the motion to limit debate. Those in favor, 137, opposed, 48, abstaining 2. This motion requires a 2/3 majority to pass. In making that calculation, abstentions are not counted. The affirmative votes are 74%. So the motion to limit debate has carried, and when we get to discussion, each speaker will be limited to 3 minutes per motion per item. All right, which committee? Doug Wells with the Legislative and Rules Committee report. Mr. Edwards, 2/3 is 67%, rounded off. Mr. Wells.
Mr. Moderator, ladies and gentlemen, our committee took up this matter on 2 occasions. We first met on May 2 in a joint session with the Finance and the Legislative and Rules Committee. Also were the members of the joint subcommittee, RTM members, and members of the public. This was an opportunity after the rules had been promulgated for there to be public discussion. We had discussion that evening. Questions were answered that were from the audience by the JSC members, and however, nobody had a quorum that night. Neither Finance Committee nor Legislative Rules Committee had a quorum that evening, so no votes were taken. We met again at our regular meeting on June 3, 2013. At that meeting, we made some revisions to the lease policy guidelines based on our input from the May meeting, and those guidelines were unanimously approved, 11-0 with District 10 absent. and we voted at that time to submit the approved draft to the RTM for its approval at this meeting. I won't belabor the what I've put in my explanatory notes. That is essentially the committee report from June. Hopefully you've all read that. You have a perspective of the history behind the need to develop lease policy guidelines and the overwhelming approval of this body back in March of 2010 to ask that the town promulgate lease policy guidelines. As we know, that didn't happen, and so we've obtained the lease policy guidelines from the Joint Subcommittee. It's important to note that the Legislative and Rules Committee is recommending that these lease policy guidelines be added to the appendix of the rules. That is an important distinction, that it is not going to be part of our rules because it will serve as an aid to the RTM members as a guideline when reviewing town leases, licenses, and management operating agreements, and will suggest a formula to help the RTM in its decision-making process. Adoption of the lease policy guidelines does not require the RTM or any of its members to vote a certain way. Rather, it is intended to provide objective criteria that may be helpful to the RTM members at the time of a vote. These are not mandatory rules. These are advisory. You can take these, you can use the part that you think is important to you, the other parts you can disregard. But these are a guideline that can be used, but it's not a mandatory rule change. Nobody is going to force feed this to you when it comes time for you to make a decision on a lease. They're advisory in nature. Additionally, the lease policy guidelines will be forwarded to all lessees and licensees, and it will help to inform them what would be expected of them when they enter into a new lease or to renew a lease with the town. Thank you. Oh, one thing, we also, in September, this came back to us. At that time, only the Commodore from the Old Greenwich Boat Club showed up. We answered her questions. Her name is Kim Crocco. We invited her to make any suggested revisions to the lease policy guidelines. She chose not to make any. We offered the opportunity for Mr. Lucarelli, who'd been absent from our June meeting, to reopen the vote so he could vote, but he declined. So the only vote was the one in June, 11-0.
Thank you. Before calling for our next report, I'd like to ask if someone could bring forward the sign-up sheet that's in the back. I appreciate that. Mr. Berg, Chair of our Land Use Committee.
Good evening again. The Land Use Committee met last Monday evening. We had 11 districts represented. Kip Bergweiger and Irv Porter from the Joint Subcommittee presented this item to the Land Use Committee. They summarized the events that led up to its formulation, why the RTM wants a lease policy. They noted that the recommendation here are guidelines that would be advisory. They'd be included in the appendix to the RTM rules. They would not be binding on any member. We had several members of the community who attended and expressed their concerns about these proposed guidelines. We had Bob Krasner from Riverside, Frank Mazza, and Bill Ingraham from the Mianus River Boat Club, and others. And among their major concerns are that nonprofits like the boat clubs serving Greenwich citizens would be disinclined to invest significant funds and their time in their facilities if there was a significant risk that their leases would not be renewed. In response to those concerns, Mr. Bergweiger responded to say that, for example, if a nonprofit tenant like a boat club wanted to invest a large amount of money in their property and they only had a few years left to go on their lease, that group should renegotiate its lease at that time, not go ahead and invest and let the lease run out. Likewise, Mr. Bergweiger noted that a tenant that planned to invest very a very large amount of money, millions of dollars, the example being the Greenwich Adult Daycare Center, that group should negotiate a term of lease that's appropriate. I believe I heard that the Greenwich Adult Daycare lease is 40 years. The Byram Schubert Library is 99 years. So with that, I think where we were going with this was there was a sense in the committee that although most of these concerns could be explained, that the way that the language in the current guidelines might not be clear to future generations of RTM members. And therefore, a motion was made to refer this item back to Finance and to Legislative and Rules and to the Joint Subcommittee to clarify these few paragraphs that seem to be concerning so many of the nonprofit groups. So at the appropriate time, Mr. Moderator, on behalf of the Land Use Committee, I'd like to make that motion.
All right, that would be after the committee reports.
Thank you.
Thank you. Karen Sodicon, Chairman of our Parks and Recreation Committee.
Good evening, Mr. Moderator, members and guests. Irv Porter from Finance and Kit Bergweger from Legislative and Rules presented the proposed leasing policy to our committee on Tuesday. The vote was 2-8-0. The Parks and Rec Committee felt the policy needed to be simplified to one page perhaps, and that the policy should be a well-drafted and consistent document with due consideration being given to the amount of lease compensation to be paid, but taking into consideration capital improvements made by the tenants. The policy needs to be user-friendly by committees. Historically, leases come quite often to Parks and Rec, and whatever policy document is put in place needs to be usable. The one presented is lengthy and not the most user-friendly. We were reminded that the original issues leading up to the question of leases, whereas where locations of the leases would be in Town Hall, the need for standard insurance terms and leases, and the consistency of the terms of leases. Our committee discussed generally the leases, did not take up specific leases. Specifically, our committee member Dave Detchen proposes a lease that keeps the scope of the review fairly general rather than trying to micromanage the Board of Selectmen or the legal department. David suggests that such a scope might include some of the following 6 points. They're well drafted and I would like to share them with you. Number 1, the selection of the party to whom the lease is awarded was not arbitrary or capricious and does not appear to reflect undue favoritism. 2, the lease as a contract document is well drafted and does not include ambiguous or internally inconsistent clauses. 3, the lease is commercially reasonable and considers the terms of the duration of the contract, the ability to amortize any capital investment the tenant is making, the scope of permitted activities by the tenant under the lease, the degree of legal liability protection of the town. Number 4, the lease is as close as reasonably possible to the standard of uniform form of lease that the town prefers to use or includes as many standard and uniform contract clauses of various types covering various topics as the town prefers to use. 5, the use of the proposed site or facility is reasonable and appropriate from the perspective of the town's desire to provide appropriate recreational, cultural, and public service facilities to the town, or alternatively, if no recreational, cultural, or public service concerns are involved, is the highest and best use to achieve an appropriate financial return for the town. 6, the lease reflects due consideration of various factors in determining the amount of rental consideration to be paid, including likely market rent for the use intended, the amount of capital investment being made by the tenant, or the costs being assumed by the tenant, which would otherwise have been the burden of the town. Thank you, David, for drafting this great alternative. And again, our vote was 2-8-0.
Thank you. Gordon Ennis with the report of our Finance Committee.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Ladies and gentlemen, good evening again. The Finance Committee enjoyed a visit by Mr. Bergweger and Mr. Porter, who led the discussion, also had 2 members of the Joint Committee available to answer questions and comment on the content of the policy. We had a lively discussion and 2 amendments. The amendments were offered by the delegate from District 9. One was withdrawn, the other was voted on, and it sought to amend Section 5B, Paragraph 4, Line 5, to spread the resources or allocate the resources, the responsibility for those resources to the appropriate town department. The change there would be the appropriate town department. The motion failed on a vote of 3-9-0. Districts 1, 4, and 9 supported the amendments, but the majority of the committee was reluctant to make minor changes to the document after it has received so much public and committee scrutiny. Our votes at the end were 8 in favor, 4 against. District 1 was not pleased with the language, fearing that the preference to taxpayers may induce a liability to the town along the freedom of speech arguments that we heard regarding Sound Beach. District 4 felt there were too many things in the document that they didn't like, and therefore he couldn't vote for it. District 8 voted no because the document will be made part of the appendix to the RTM rules, which means that there'll be no effective policy from an RTM point of view, except the policy which was drafted by the Board of Selectmen and exists today and is, in fact, I think adequately described as an ad hoc approach to each individual lease. And District 9 voted no because they weren't ready yet to vote yes. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Mr. Berg.
So, as I was saying, the Land Use Committee moved to refer this item back to Legislative Rules, Finance, and its joint subcommittee in order to clarify the few paragraphs that are concerning the outside groups, the boat clubs, for example. Our vote on that item was 9-0. District 3 opposed that motion to refer back because he said he would have preferred to vote down the guidelines. District 9 also voted no because she wasn't confident that even with further clarifications that future RTMs would agree on interpretations of the document. In referring this item back, the Land Use Committee asked that the following issues be addressed. Number 1, clearer differentiation between the requirements of commercial leases versus public use leases, such as the boat clubs. And secondly, support for prior and future capital investments as one of the criteria for lease renewal. So once again, our vote on this item was to refer back as 9-0. So that is our motion to the RTM.
So the motion is simply a motion to refer back to 3 groups?
That's correct, to Legislative Rules, Finance, and the Joint Subcommittee.
All right. Let me ask the chairs of our Finance and Legislative and Rules Committee. I assume you set up this joint subcommittee, is that correct?
That's right.
Is it still in existence?
It is.
Okay. So there is a motion now pending on behalf of our Land Use Committee. It does not require a second, to refer item 4 back to our Legislative and Rules Committee, our Finance Committee, and the subcommittee set up to consider the lease issue. The rest of what you said is not part of the motion. It can be instructive, but they would be free to do with it as they see fit. All right, a motion to refer is debatable. It only requires a majority to pass. Now, we do have speakers who signed up to speak on the merits of item 4, and let me just caution you that debate on the motion to refer may not go into the merits of the underlying item, except as necessary to address the proposed referral. So we're not debating item 4 now. It's just, should we refer it back? All right, and I remind all speakers that there is a 3-minute limit in effect. So now, what I was going to say was we do have a list of speakers interested in speaking on the merits. This is now a different issue, so I'm not going to assume that all those who signed up want to speak on this item, but you're certainly welcome to. So I'll ask anyone interested in speaking to the motion to refer to please come down the side aisle, and we will proceed. Mr. Wells, speaking individually on the motion to refer.
I'm going to just first of all make one thing clear, and that is if what the Land Use Committee has asked to be done is to refer this matter back for the items that are listed in the report. One, a clearer differentiation between requirements for commercial versus public use leases.
Well, Mr. Wells, let me just stop you because all that is before us is a motion to refer. You can look to guidance, but that's not part of the motion. So that's not limiting on, if we were to refer it, what Mr. Berg read is not a limiting factor on those who...
It's just referred back to us then?
It's referred back to you, yes.
We're not bound by this?
No.
Fine.
This is a motion to refer back to those 3 groups. That is all it is. There were some explanations given for the motivation, but that is the motion. All right, Lucy Krasner, District 5. Speaking on the motion to refer.
Since, as the moderator mentioned, this is not a time to speak to the merits, which I would like to do, I will simply say I don't think this is appropriate at this time to vote to refer back. I think we're going to get the same document that we got with minor changes, so I think referring back is an inappropriate suggestion, and I think we need full discussion on this item, and I urge you not to refer back until such time as we've had full discussion, and I actually urge you not to refer back, but to really vote the item up or down after considerable discussion.
Dr. Carlson, to be followed by Mr. Pirelli-Minetti.
Mr. Moderator, members of the RTM, very late in life, Marcus Cato the Younger said that any government is better than no government. And I think what we have before us is a proposal that's half-baked and that would probably go down tonight if there was a vote. The idea of governing the situation that we have of giving these leases is real. It is a genuine thing that needs to be handled by this organization. To throw everything out with a down vote tonight, I think is a great mistake. The right way to handle this and to get us out of this room in very reasonable time is to vote to refer this and to ask these committees to do a thorough job and have some sessions of public comment on this in the month of October, and to bring this and hopefully to bring the whole thing back to us in December, and so that we can have some kind of coherent policy. And once we have a coherent policy, the boat club gets its lease for $1 a year. Thank you.
Mr. Pirelli-Minetti, District 12.
Good evening. I'm going to suggest you vote not to refer back.
I've been a member of the Joint Subcommittee as well as being the co-chairman of the lease committee that operated from the fall of 2010 through the middle of 2012. One of the reasons that I think that you should not refer back, and this is, if you decide that this is substantive, tell me, because I think that one of the major reasons people have suggested a referral reflects a misunderstanding of the existing policy that has been in effect for over the many years. And this is with respect to how capital improvements are dealt with. If you go back and look at the 1980 lease for the Arts Council and you look at the 2000 lease for the Arts Council, you'll see that the capital improvements were specifically mentioned in the recital that they were going to do, and that was taken into consideration when the lease terms were given. That lease also has language that specifically says that the improvements belong to the town. Similarly, with respect to the Mianus Boat Club lease, in 1990, in 1989, when that lease was up for consideration,
Please refer item 4 back to Finance, Legislative and Rules, and the Joint Subcommittee on Leases so that we can address your concerns and simplify the lease policy guidelines. Thank you.
Mark Pruner, District 10.
I also believe that this should be referred back to committee. When you look at the back of the room and the number of respected citizens that we have here who are deeply concerned about this policy, the Joint Subcommittee has labored greatly, but unfortunately they've come up with a flawed instrument. It is not time to vote on something that is flawed. We should do a better job, and I personally believe there should be a totally different approach, and we need the time to do that and to let other ideas, such as Mr. Detchens and others, that people seem to like and voted on in committee, to be developed. Tonight is not the time to vote on a flawed policy. Thank you.
Christine Edwards, District 8.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator, colleagues, and guests. I'm very happy to see that we do have citizens here in the town here tonight, because that's part of what our process is. It's not just the RTM, it's also input on behalf of our citizens. And due to that, I think that there is enough concern that's been raised tonight on the policy that to take a second look is an extremely important thing to encourage more public input on this. And certainly anyone who has taken one of the town properties that we have previously leased, put a great deal of capital in, understanding that that does go back to the town. But if we do have various languages that allow that lease to be continued and such because of that improvement, that's something that has great value because we have an improvement to something that may not have been able to have been used in that fashion, and it's a benefit to the town and to our citizens who therefore can really have a much richer experience of what Greenwich has to offer. So I do ask all my colleagues here in the room to vote to refer this back, as Peter has said, as Dr. Carlson, Mary Ferry, all respected people, Mark Pruner, and I really do go along with that and encourage you as well to vote this to refer. Thank you.
Irv Porter, District 6.
There comes a time when you have to stand up and say what you really think. The role that I had as chair was to make sure that we did what we could to gather information, analyze it, put it in a form that was useful, not to create chaos. That wasn't the purpose. Mary Ferry stated it very, very well. I ask you for your endorsement to refer this back. Thank you.
Drew Marzullo, Selectman.
I'll be quick. The lease review, could it be fine-tuned? Yes. Could it be simplified? Yes. I think that's an understatement. Many members are talking about time. How much more time, I'll ask, do you need? It's been 6, 7, 8 months now, which I think that's what's wrong with efficient government. The body has in front of them a lease policy for review. I guarantee you, if this item is referred, it'll be back without clear clarification or a clear consensus. The fact is, we do have a lease policy with oversight, with RTM oversight, and it is working. Don't refer it. Vote up or down tonight.
John Lucarelli, District 10.
Good evening. I was planning on speaking about the merits of item 4 and voting in the negative, but around and around we go. I have been on legislative rules for a good part of a decade, and I've never seen so much back and forth, subcommittees and legislative and rule committee and finance committee. I'm concerned about our folks in land use just referring it back. No mandate, no discussion, no...
Well, they did have some guidelines. They're not formally part of the motion, but they did have 2 points that they wanted to address.
This is the point, is even when it went to the subcommittee and the subcommittee's created, 10 months later, we still don't know what their original mandate is. I still think there's a lot of ambiguity, and that's how we landed in this mess. I think Minus River and Boat Club was the original impetus for this debate. Now, it's obviously, one gentleman quipped, you give a subcommittee an inch and they'll take it a mile. We're there, and this lease policy guidelines is very ambiguous. I don't think we're going to get any more added value. We have 3 committee members that said it was ready to be voted on. 2 other subcommittee members that said it still needs some work. We're all over the map on this one. I don't think you keep sending it back to committees that cannot complete. That's my opinion. Thank you.
All right, further discussion on the Land Use Committee motion to refer item 4 to our Legislative and Rules, Finance, and Lease Subcommittee. Will the district chairs please mark your voting cards? Land Use Committee motion to refer item 4. If you are in favor of sending it back for more work, you should vote yes. If you would like to dispose of it tonight or continue discussing it tonight, you should vote no. We will need to await the result of that vote before proceeding further. So, is Ms. Caldwell, did you want to make, you had an announcement that you would have preferred to have made at the beginning of the meeting, so now's a good time for that.
Mr. Moderator, members of the RTM, the League of Women Voters asked that I make the following announcement for them. The League is sponsoring a presentation on the state of the state by Governor Daniel Malloy on Monday, October 7th at the Town Hall meeting room from 7 p.m. to 8:30 p.m. It's anticipated that the governor's presentation will take about 20 to 25 minutes. The balance of the evening, the hour and a half, will be devoted to questions and answers. So that's Monday, October 7th, 7 p.m., Town Hall meeting room.
All right. And it may come of interest to the members of District 6, Old Greenwich, that you are the only district, I should say we are the only district, that has a contest in November. Just thought you might want to know. All right, we are awaiting the result of the vote on the motion to refer. I have the result of the vote on the Land Use Committee motion to refer item 4. Those in favor, 90. Opposed, 99. Abstaining, 2. That motion has failed. Discussion on item 4. I do have a list of speakers, so I will, in the first instance, call on those. And I'd ask that the on-deck speaker come forward and sit in this chair. We will start with Mike Harris. Is Mike Harris here? Yes? To be followed by Michelle Smith.
Thank you. My name is Mike Harris. I am
Mr. Harris and all speakers, I just remind you that there is a 3-minute limit in effect. Yes,
I
sir.
will try not to be overzealous or speak past my limit. I am a member of the board of the Greenwich Arts Council, but I don't come to speak on their behalf. I come as a resident with a true interest in seeing a policy that will encourage nonprofits who are benefiting the town to continue to do so. I made notes before all the discussion, which some maybe seems irrelevant now. One was that rules designed to establish guidelines for every single type of use are doomed to become a scary proposition. A couple examples arise out of the confusion of the proposal and the fact that I think it can be improved substantially by defining which type of organization it's talking about, whether it's a nonprofit or it's a for-profit organization. To me, you can't tell whether capital improvements are intended to be considered in deciding whether a particular tenant has done a good job. I know that no capital improvement should ever entitle you to a lease in perpetuity, but it certainly should be considered in your value as a tenant and what you've done with the property in the past and what kind of a steward you have been. I now understand from hearing comments that putting properties out to bid supposedly doesn't apply to nonprofits, but that isn't very clear to me in the guidelines. I recommend that the proposals be turned down. I was hoping that it would go back to the Legislative and Rules Committee, but if that's not going to happen, then I would hope you vote against.
Thank you. Michelle Smith, to be followed by Stuart Adelberg.
This is my first RTM meeting, and it's been interesting. I'll reserve judgment for later. I'm a resident of Riverside. I'm here tonight as president of the Garden Education Center of Greenwich and on behalf of our 18 board members and 416 members. As you're aware, the Garden Education Center is currently a grateful beneficiary of a $1 lease of its buildings from the town and will be impacted by the proposed new leasing policy guidelines. I completely understand the need for the town to review its current policy and develop clear and concise guidelines on leasing of town property. However, some of the proposed changes in their current format are very detrimental to nonprofits like the GEC. I've heard comments, and that was interesting, but I feel like they can be clarified. Some sections can be clarified. Section C, paragraphs 3 and 4, refer to, quote, advertising the availability of such property for lease at a market rate, unquote. If that's not the case, then please change the wording. Organizations like the GEC could not possibly compete with commercial businesses in the rent that they might be willing to pay, yet we do provide valuable services to the citizens of the town. The second proposed change that I can't support is that, quote, prior tenant improvements should not be included, unquote, when considering a lease renewal, as mentioned in Section B, paragraph 8. That would mean that the many capital improvements the GEC has made to the buildings via private donations, including the renovation of our horticulture building, would not be considered when the RTM reviews our lease. Such a policy would discourage private donor contributions to improve town-owned properties used by nonprofits like the GEC. Now that it's not going back to committee, I urge you to vote no. Thank you.
Stuart Adelberg, to be followed by John Lucarelli.
Mr. Moderator and members of the town meeting, I'm here this evening wearing two hats. Though I'm known most as the president of the Greenwich United Way, I'm also proud to serve as a member of the board of the Greenwich Arts Council. And I appreciate the opportunity to speak briefly about this policy. And I'll do my best to stay under 3 minutes, but if I get overzealous, jump right in. I do want to note that the United Way is, in fact, not one of the town nonprofits to benefit from the existing leasing policy. We, in fact, own our building at Lafayette Court, the benefit of a very generous contribution. Through my varied roles in the nonprofit community, I've learned that Greenwich is a town that thrives largely due to many private-public partnerships. I can attest to the fact that our United Way could not accomplish half of what it does were it not for these partnerships. I'm grateful for the cooperation we get, and I'm aware that the faith and partnership of municipal entities must be earned repeatedly by delivering benefits to the community, much the same way that the right to lease a town-owned building must be earned by the performance of those lucky enough to occupy public spaces. I believe the development of a clear policy for those who would lease town facilities is appropriate, and as a taxpayer, I truly appreciate the time and thought that went into the current proposal. It is the job of elected officials to ensure that town properties are being used to provide maximum benefit to the community, and I believe that this is the goal that drove the development of this plan. With this said, however, there are a few facets of the proposal with the potential to negatively impact these benefits, and you're certainly going to hear a trend based on what some others have said already. From my perspective, the most significant concern is the fact, if I understand and read the proposal correctly, that the value of improvements made to town-owned facilities will not be a factor in determining the extension of a lease for an existing tenant. Though I understand that no tenant should assume that an extension of a lease is assumed, simply because the tenant made improvements and invested in the property, eliminating the improvements and investments considerations just doesn't seem right. If a nonprofit organization offers to step in, provide a quantifiable community benefit by soliciting charitable contributions, investing in and improving unusable public facilities, and said nonprofit can document that is fulfilling its agreement to the satisfaction of town leaders, I don't understand why the improvements should not be a consideration in deciding whether they get a potential extension. Not a guarantee, but at least a factor for consideration. I'm not going to mention the issue of the of market rate because apparently that's been clarified.
30 seconds.
Okay. Some of the properties that could be affected by this proposing lease came about through the generosity of philanthropic gifts, as are the capital improvements that are done. And I will just, since I have only 30 seconds, I just will say that I would be concerned in soliciting capital contributions to make improvements to town properties or in soliciting the contribution of town properties if, in fact, this policy questions how long the benefit will be to that organization. I believe organizations will have a hard time attracting capital dollars to make those improvements. Thank you. So I do urge you to vote this down.
John Lucarelli, to be followed by Bernard Schneider.
In the interest of time, I've scrapped my 20-minute speech for the 3-minute speech. I'm going to have to, I'm going to be a little choppy here, but I rise also as the former POCD Town Properties Chair. Many of my committee members are here and were members of the RTM committees that had voted on this. I don't want to discredit the subcommittee's work. I think they did a great job. They worked very hard, but I think the lease policies fall short of the original committee's mandate. I also didn't think that the Band-Aid type edits would achieve their goals either. I call this is a case of more right church, wrong pew. We've identified an issue, but I don't think the RTM was the place to fix it. The issue we identified is like what we identified in the POCD Town Properties Committee is we need a better, more transparent governance of town properties. These town properties total over $2 billion conservatively valued, and they're tangentially managed by various department heads, Board of Selectmen, administrators, and RTM committees. But there's no one-stop shopping if we've got an issue with a town property. And it does reside with the First Selectman's office. The way we handle it in the town properties, not to leave you just complaining about item 4, but also the solution, is to create a town property management committee or a stewardship committee or something along those lines that is a dotted line to the First Selectman to have a public vetting of these issues. Not done in RTM committees, done at a different level with town lawyers and whatnot, and talk about all the town property issues, not just leases. We also talk about asset allocation, optimizing the real estate portfolio, different things that come up, and made up of real estate professionals. I think we've lost sight of that. Even the subcommittee, they did a great job, but I didn't see a real estate as many of their backgrounds. And we certainly have a dearth of real estate professionals here in Greenwich. Back to the guidelines, it would not be wise to have the RTM play landlord, especially with such ambiguous language being added to the appendix of the town's rules. This is not a sensitive meeting resolution, and this will be used. We will use this. We will be scrutinizing leases. Trust me, another subcommittee will be formed in the next election cycle, and we'll be grilling these same leaseholders. And one size fits all. We tried to do this in town properties. One size fits all lease policy language will not have the desired effect that we think it was. You can't apply it to museums, teen centers, boat clubs, adult daycare centers. Stu Otterberg's
30 seconds.
Oh, God, I got to move. That being said, I also rise to bring forth the game-changing document that was forwarded to me over the weekend. I won't go into specifics, but it's from the Army Corps of Engineers by Richard Roach in 1984, time-stamped by the Parks and Recs Division, made out to Frank Keegan. In it, it had a document on defining open in all terms. Now, open to all on equal terms, I should say. A management system that should be considered acceptable provided that it does not impose arbitrary fees or arbitrary variations in fees amongst users. The cost of providing necessary management and ancillary facilities and services may be offset through, I request 30 seconds more. Thank you.
Well, Mr. Lucarelli.
I think this is an important governing document.
The body would have to grant that by a 2/3 vote. And I think you know what the outcome of that vote would be.
You know where I stand.
Bernard Schneider, to be followed by Chris von Keyserling.
Thank you. I think we owe a great debt to the RTM and its committees for their strong work in identifying and bringing to light and lending coherence and information to the lease policies. I think that's a heroic effort. I think the matter went off the rails a bit with this particular lease policy. And I'm not against it because I have a particular substantive issue. Everyone here says it's ambiguous, and I would agree, and I think that's its main problem. I don't think it's a clearly drafted document. What is a clearly drafted document? It's, for example, let's say you're a teacher and you have a policy for your students. If they do X, then A happens. It's all clear. You can point to it in the document. Those of you who contract to build on your houses, landscapes, you have an agreement. I mean, there can be contingencies, but you know exactly what's going to happen beforehand. You want your lawyer to say, if that happens, this is covered. As we've heard too often here already, this document, and people have characterized it in different ways, it's ambiguous. People can find different things in there. You ask about this capital improvement, you get pointed to all similar situations are treated equally. We've now learned, for example, that even as to the boat clubs, there are significant differences and they shouldn't necessarily be all looked at the same. The thing I wanted to add very clearly is I don't think it'd be a useful exercise to try and amend this document, as some people have suggested. It's just going to be here and there and so on. So I'm going to make two final thoughts because I think many of my points have already been covered. First, in my view, I think we should put together in generic terms two documents. One is the introduction from the town lease policy adopted by the select board, and I think Mr. Detchens hit it right on the nail, 100%. Secondly, the question comes up, what do we do with the Mayanas Boat Club lease that is coming up next meeting or soon? I think this organization has enough information, enough knowledge, enough sense of what leases in this town are. We've been fully informed about all the major issues. We now know some of the specific nuances at Mayanas Boat Club lease.
30 seconds.
So I think we'd be quite prepared, whatever we do with the lease policy, to vote on these leases as they come up. I think the committee's work has been heroic in informing us, and I think we should take advantage of that. Thank you.
Chris von Keyserling, to be followed by Kip Bergweger.
Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Moderator, thank you. I'll continue what Mr. Lucarelli was trying to put forward. He received this document over the weekend. I believe he's copied it to the various committee heads and officials, but wasn't time enough to have it distributed to the body. This was, as you say, this, as was said, this is a letter sent in response to the town's request by the Chief Engineer, Enforcement Section, Regulatory Branch, Operations Division of the Department of the Army, Army Corps of Engineers. It's about access and use of public facilities and rare assets, such as the waterfronts. It says in that, among other things, does not, as long as there's management plan, remember this was done at the time we're worrying about the beach policies and access, so this was pretty critical. Does not impose arbitrary fees or arbitrary variation in fees among users. The cost of providing necessary management, ancillary facilities, and services may be offset through equitable user fees based on the actual costs incurred. It follows up with another list of 7 points as guidance. The 7th one says, assure that facilities located within the Federal Navigation Project limits will not be used as profit-making operations. Fees charged should cover the costs of operating and maintaining the facilities. Now, if you look at the town properties we're talking about, certainly the boat clubs, there is no money in the town expenses for that. We're covering costs only. The costs of that property, if it costs the town anything, many of these were donated, if it costs anybody, have been amortized off years and years ago. There's no value per se in that land as an expense item. It's certainly valuable if you wanted to sell it, but you can't. So the point is, and this is about user and access of public property for the public good, for the service of the people, not for the service of income. And it says, it shall not charge more than is reasonable recovery of your expenses of the town. In this case, there are no expenses in the town. In the case of the boat club there, the boat club has saved the town approximately $100,000 to $100,000 a year in operation costs every year in-kind
30
services
seconds.
and personnel. It also has invested $5-6 odd million in there. These are items that the town could not require of these people under the Army Corps of Engineers policy. If they wish to give it to us, that's fine, but we do not have the right to require them of it. If you start looking at this and you put it together with what the purpose of public use is and the highest and best civic use is, you can see that most of the policy guidelines that we're talking about here really are inapplicable. Thank you.
Mr. Bergweger,
vote
to be
no.
followed by Mr. Warner, Mike Warner.
I'd first like to remind you that if you vote down the guidelines, the only policy in effect in the town will be that of the Board of Selectmen, which has a very useful process, but the decisions on the terms and the organization to whom or to which property will be leased will be on a case-by-case basis, which the RTM did not find to be a satisfactory standard the last time we addressed this question. It has been argued that the guidelines are too long and complex and they should be bullet points fitting on one page. Well, when each of us joined the RTM, we received a set of documents that we were expected to read and understand. Among those are the charter, which contains, my copy, 161 pages. We have the rules of the RTM, which contain 17 pages, and an appendix with 11 subheadings that occupy 31 pages, and items that are not addressed by these are covered by Robert's Rules of Orders with 669 pages. I personally believe that everyone in this room is very capable of reading the guidelines, which occupy only 9 pages in the call, and understanding them. I do not believe that you're not capable of understanding this work. It has been argued that the guidelines will prevent the town from renewing public-private partnership leases. Again, the Board of Selectmen's policy is an ad hoc, case-by-case basis. These guidelines, in contrast, recommend that the town, in considering any renewal, give credit to prospective benefits accruing to the town during the term of the proposed renewal. If you want to check, it's paragraph 8 on page 5 of the call. The guidelines require the town. Some have argued that financial benefit is going to override the benefits to be received from non-for-profit organizations. That's just not true. only when the town has made a decision to put financial concerns above everything else does the town give financial analysis credit or maximum credit. Otherwise, the benefits that these not-for-profit organizations are giving to the town are to be taken into account, and the prospective tenant or the renewal tenant
30
is to be given credit for that. Some have argued that there is a bias against renewal. There is no bias or presumption in favor of or against any particular aspect of leasing. As has been noted, these are guidelines. You vote your conscience, and these will give you some benefit to understand the issues that might come before you. If you vote this down, the only thing you'll have is, well, case-by-case basis. That's not beneficial, and this is not micromanaging the leasing process. This is
Thank you.
helpful for these are recommendations to guide you. Thank you.
Mike Warner, to be followed by Mr. Curtis. Do you want to speak? By Paul Curtis.
Good evening. My name is Mike Warner from District 3. I think it would be useful to go back and reflect on why we started this process to begin with. As I recall, the issue was fairness. That is, we have certain boat clubs in town that have requirements to get a slip based on tenure. And what we have is citizens in the town who have been here 10 years or so, tax-paying citizens, who have no chance of getting a slip at a boat club, even though they've been in town for quite some time. And these guidelines, and they are guidelines, say every individual will have an equal opportunity or some opportunity to use a resource that's a scarce resource for the town, and one that that we should make more available. Does it involve any draconian changes? I don't think so, but the guidelines point us in a direction of fairness, and I think that's an admirable and a worthwhile goal that's accomplished with these guidelines. Secondly, the other reason this was proposed was that the town doesn't know the value of what the resource is. And one of the things most controversial in this lease guidelines is that from time to time we try to establish a value. That doesn't mean that we should charge the people who are taking advantage of the resource that value, but we ought to know what the value is of a piece of property before we go ahead and lease it for $1. It's worthwhile for the town to know that information. And that's also accomplished in this guideline. The guideline doesn't say that any individual is going to be charged the market rate. Certainly it's not a costly endeavor, but as a management, we should know what the value is of anything we are providing to very worthwhile organizations. So those are the key things that I think that we should look at in evaluating this. And I think this document, while it is constructed by attorneys, and it does have all the I's dotted and T's crossed, we should vote in favor of this agreement. I think it benefits our town. Thank you.
Paul Curtis, to be followed by Rob Pirelli-Minetti.
Good evening, colleagues. It's very simple. I joined the RTM 12 years ago. The RTM has currently, today, the ability to approve or disapprove a lease that is presented to us. What the RTM does not do is negotiate the lease. So if we turn down any lease, it has to go back and be renegotiated. That is done with the selectman's office and the town attorney, as well as the tenant. We already have that power. We don't have the power to change the terms of the lease. We can recommend things, but those terms are negotiated, and they're not negotiated by us. The report that was generated by the Joint Committee is outstanding. They did a lot of work. There are a lot of good points and a lot of guidelines. However, I don't believe this is necessary to be part of our rules, nor our appendices. As a document to guide us in the questions we ask of the Selectman's office if they're doing the negotiation, or Mr. Fox's office as a town attorney, they're excellent. But as a guiding principle that we must do, no. And since they are not rules, they are not statute or regulations, they carry no authority. So as guidelines, they're great. You can use them all you want. It's a great piece of work. But as part of our rules and appendices, I do not think that they should be there, and I suggest that we vote this down. Thank you.
Rob Pirelli Minetti, to be followed by Lucy Krasner.
I'm back. I just want to first say I think that Mr. Curtis is incorrect. It is, in fact, the RTM is the only body in the town that has the authority to approve leases, and therefore we do have the authority to change the terms of the lease. If a lease is brought to the RTM with a particular set of terms, the RTM can say, no, we won't approve that term. We'll approve a lease that has other terms. And that's up to the people with whom we have negotiated the lease to discuss with the town, but it really is the RTM. The RTM has never, by statute, delegated to the selectmen the authority to issue leases. So that's the first thing. The second point is that the points that have been made by a number of speakers that it will make it hard for nonprofits to raise money if we don't take prior tenant improvements into account is really a straw man argument, because these financial commitments are undertaken before a lease is granted. You don't, in the middle of a lease, negotiate a new improvement. If you do, you have to come to the town to get approval anyway. The leases all say no improvements can be made without town approval. So if you want to make an improvement, there is a natural negotiation which would bring the whole question of the term of the lease and anything else to be taken into account into the matter. And let me leave you with one question. If you're going to take prior tenant improvements into account, how long would you take them into account? If the Byannis River Boat Club, for example, spent $5 million in 1985, do we take that into account for 30 years, for 50 years, for 100 years? The reason that we said that we don't want to take prior improvements into account in looking forward is because there's no way to know how far back you should look. The only way you can do it is when you're looking forward to give somebody a new lease, to take the capital improvements that are supposed to be done in that new lease and let them have a lease that fully amortizes those capital improvements. That's fair. But truly, how long do you let a capital improvement continue in effect? Obviously not forever. That makes no sense at all. So I would urge you to approve these guidelines as they are. They're not perfect, but I think they're a lot better than anything else that has been proposed or can reasonably be proposed. Thank you.
All right, that actually is the final speaker who signed up, Lucy Krasner, District 5.
Good evening. I'd like to take a different perspective. Various speakers have referred to the selectmen's policy on the leasing of town land as ad hoc, case by case, and said that that's a bad thing. Frankly, if you look at this document, it's a 2-page document, and it's an excellent document. And I think what is proposed, the guidelines of the Joint Committee, should be turned down, and we should use this guideline. In it, the selectmen refer to such requests for leasing of the town land shall discuss in detail the public benefit that is expected to accrue from the use of the property. Public-private partnerships in which the town is unable to provide certain services but is desirous to do so will be sought and encouraged. So it discusses a whole policy which I think is of a different tenor in mood and moral obligation than what the guidelines that are before us from the Joint Committee are proposing, which really turns everything upside down, makes it kind of a commercial issue. And the second page of our selectmen's guidelines, again, is very well thought out. It talks about leases being referred to the law department. It has a whole process here, a whole procedure. It's not an ad hoc piece of junk that wasn't considered. It's a very good document with process and procedure. Things go to the law department. Then if MI improvement is needed, further discussion of the Board of Selectmen, P&Z Commission will discuss it if necessary. Board of Selectmen again will approve it, the lease, to go before the RTM. It's a complete process, but in the beginning, it is a policy that speaks to, I think, the wishes of the people to assist and in town-owned leases, town-owned land being leased to organizations. What's the best good of that land for the people in town? I think that as I said, the feeling and the tenor of this lengthy, wordy, confusing document that's in front of us doesn't give value to the enormous amount of time and volunteers that these nonprofits give to the town of Greenwich, that Greenwich would have to pay an enormous amount to employees to provide the same sort of services. The volunteers' times are amazingly important to our town, to our way of life.
30 seconds.
In many cases, these organizations took derelict buildings and made them gems for our community. And the Selectmen's guidelines as they are, I think, are excellent and should be used without the new proposed guidelines, which should be turned down.
Jill Oberlander.
I think you know why I'm here. I'd like to call on two of the prior speakers' comments. One, in talking about what's ambiguous. So the Board of Selectmen's policy states that leases that are proposed to the members of the Board of Selectmen shall be evaluated by the members of the board individually based on their best judgment on a case-by-case basis. Now, in my opinion, if I were a future tenant, that to me is ambiguous as to what I would be judged based on. I want to read also to you from an email that was distributed to District 2 on Saturday from Adele Titel, a past president, former board member, and current advisor of the Greenwich Arts Council. She wrote, as you've heard tonight, countless volunteer hours were spent raising hundreds of dollars to transform the old town hall's second floor into a gallery. She further wrote, that effort would never have been made without the assurance that the GAC could remain in the building as long as we continue to carry out our mission. And I raise this comment because it seems to hit right on why we need the policy and the provision that the lease should encompass all of the terms of the agreement. I also want to clarify prior commenters who have said that the policy would discourage nonprofits and would not allow for the taking into account of capital improvements. As Mr. Bergweger pointed out, and if you look at the provisions of the policy, now I've lost the section, that says capital investment proposed by a tenant and described in a proposed lease, tenant improvements may appropriately be considered in setting the length of the initial term and specifically permitted renewals in such lease. It just goes back to saying that if you invest, you should negotiate it in your lease, which should contain the exact date of termination, and you should make sure that you've covered your amortization, and that 30, 40, 50, 60 years from now, you should not come back and say, take into account my prior investment in the benefit that you're accounting for. I'm not saying that tenants should not say, we've been a good tenant, we've invested in this town. I'm just saying that the benefits of the lease, when it's presented to the RTM, should not extend that term for a capital investment that's been previously accrued. I hope you vote for these lease policy guidelines. While they are just guidelines, I disagree with Mr. Curtis. I think they will inform the debate for years to come by encouraging RTM members to ask the town difficult questions when they present a lease. I ask you to look back on the types of leases and the documentation that we received prior to starting this process and ask yourself, was it informative? Was it complete? Was it helpful?
Well, did you want to speak? I was going to call for the question. Mr. Detchen, did you want to speak? David Detchen, District 10. To be followed by Mr. Tuthill.
I really don't have a dog in this hunt, to use an old Kentucky term, but I think we're mixing two things up. I think, first of all, there may be the selectmen's policy on what kinds of leases they would like to have and encourage, and that's something for them to have in terms of their going in to the selection of a tenant, a potential tenant, and the negotiation. What we're talking about is our standard of review after the lease has been negotiated, and we're deciding whether we do or do not want to approve it. Those are two different things to my mind. And I think what we have before us this evening is the question of what should be our standard of review once a lease has been fully negotiated and is then brought before us for consideration as to whether we're going to approve it or disapprove it. My only concern in terms of the dynamics, and it doesn't make a lot of difference to me whether it is a detailed guideline like we are proposing or a more general guideline, 6 points, 5 points, whatever it is, 1 page or 2 pages, is that we need to recognize that we will be reviewing a lease that has already been negotiated, that is essentially completed, not yet signed, of course, because we haven't approved it, but we need to be thinking in terms of the mentality of the lawyers representing the town and the people who are negotiating the lease. They're not going to enter into leases, negotiations freely if there is a high degree of likelihood that for some reason or another we are going to turn down the lease. We need to be thinking about what is our scope of review after the lease has already been negotiated. Yes, we can reject it and say we'd like this or that to be changed, but the fact of the matter is we need to be thinking about how many potential tenants will be eager to engage in an extended period of negotiation if there's a high likelihood that we're going to reject it. So whether it's a large, long list or a short list, we need to be thinking about what is going to be our role in the overall process. We approve the lease, but we don't negotiate it. Thank you.
All right. Will the district chairs please mark your voting cards? Item number 4, lease guidelines, and proceed to poll your delegation. If you are in favor of adopting item number 4, you vote yes. Otherwise, you vote no. While we are voting, we will continue. We have 2 additional items to dispose of tonight. Item number 6 now comes before us. Jim Michael, Chief Engineer for the Town of Greenwich, with a substitute resolution.
Mr. Moderator, members of the RTM, item number 6, resolve that the Town of Greenwich grant easements at the Old Greenwich train station, Southside parking lot located at 0 Sound Beach Avenue, 0 Arcadia Road, Old Greenwich, to the Connecticut Department of Transportation and the Connecticut Light and Power. Be it further resolved that the first selectman of the Town of Greenwich is hereby authorized to execute such easements on behalf of the Town of Greenwich. Thank you.
All right, now this is a substitute which adds that last sentence that you just read, is that correct? Correct. All right, does everybody have that? This adds, be it further resolved that the first selectman of the Town of Greenwich is hereby authorized to execute such easements on behalf of the Town of Greenwich. Will a member please move the adoption of that substitute resolution? The substitute resolution on item 6 has been moved and seconded. May we have the committee reports on this item, beginning with Mr. Small, Chair of our Transportation Committee.
Thank you very much, Mr. Moderator, members of the RTM. Transportation Committee met in joint session with Public Works Committee. We had Jim Michael present from DPW to describe in detail the 2 easements to Connecticut Light and Power and Connecticut DOT. The easement to the DOT is for a strip of land about 3 feet wide on which they're going to build a retaining wall, and the CL&P easement is for utility work to bury utilities and give them ability to take care of those utilities after they're installed. There's going to be a period of 3 years that this construction's going on, and we're going to lose about 100 parking spaces during that period. I discussed with Alan Corey.
Excuse me, Mr. Small, let me ask our members to please vote quietly and give attention to our speaker. Thank you. Mr. Small.
Thank you. Alan Corey of Parking Services looked more at the end product, in which the town is going to gain 89 parking spaces than losing 100 parking spaces for a couple of years. He felt that he had cut back on issuing new permits over the last couple of years in anticipation of this project, and that about 100 spaces were not being used. So he felt that for a few years that would work out okay. Someone had raised issues of traffic and discussion with Jim Michael. 89 cars coming on to Sound Beach when 15,000 cars travel that road each day. When the time period that they would come to the train station is staggered, it didn't seem like a big deal. And in terms of soil, some issue was raised about that. The Connecticut DOT is going to be handling the soil. They've done some borings, and there was no indication of any type of contamination. So Alan Corey indicated that about $1 million in new revenue is going to be coming in from these parking spaces, and that the DOT was going to be adding value of about $1 million with some green spaces that could be planted. Sound Beach, it was Jim Michael who mentioned that out of the 3 to 4 years that this construction is going to be going on, they're planning right now to have a total of about 30 days that the Sound Beach would be closed, with a span of no more than 3 days at a time, which we thought was very good plan, and I hope it works out that way. Transportation Committee voted 8-0-0 with districts 2, 4, 6, and 12 absent. Thank you very much.
Thank you. John DeChapel, Chair of our Public Works Committee.
My colleague in Transportation said it all. We at Public Works voted 12-0-0, and hope we'll get started. Thank you.
Thank you. Doug Wells with our Legislative and Rules Report.
We had Jim Michael and Wayne Fox help us with this item. The only additional thing that the prior speakers missed was that in addition to the parking spots, we're going to get new lighting, repaving of the parking lot, as well as construction of new sidewalks and installation of additional bicycle racks and new signage. Mr. Michael was asked about some of the language in the CL&P easement because Mr. Fox had indicated that some of the language was not finalized. We were also concerned about the fact that the resolution did not indicate which town official would be granting the easement. It was unclear, based on our discussions with Mr. Michael and Attorney Fox, whether these easements would be signed off by the First Selectman or the Commissioner of the DPW. Our committee felt that the resolution should properly designate the signing authority, which is the purpose of the substitute resolution, which is confirmed that the Selectman will be signing these easements if they're granted. There was also some concern on our committee's report part because the easements were not in final form. We asked Mr. Michael about whether he believed he could have the resolution in final form by this Monday evening. A particular concern to our committee was that there was a term in the CL&P easement referring to self-help, meaning that CL&P could cut trees, come in and do things on the property without seeking prior approval. So we decided to postpone this item until this Monday evening, when we were to find out whether or not the language in the easement has been finalized. I can say happily that it was. The issue of the self-help was removed from the document, and other matters that concerned our committee were also cleared up in the final easement document. So we voted this evening on the matter 10-0 with districts 4 and 12 absent.
Thank you. Discussion on item 6. Will the district chairs please mark your voting cards? Item number 6, substitute resolution on item 6, and proceed to poll your delegation. Item number 7 now comes before us. Amina Ahmad, of our Law Department with that resolution.
Good evening, Mr. Moderator, members of the RTM. Item number 7, resolved that the representative town meeting consider enacting an ordinance establishing a harbor management commission for the town of Greenwich pursuant to the Connecticut Harbor Management Act, Connecticut General Statute, sections 22A-113K through 22A-113T.
Thank you. Will the member please move the adoption of the resolution? The resolution on item 7 has been moved and seconded. May we have the committee reports on this? Before we begin, however, I do have the result of the vote on item number 4, which are the proposed lease guidelines. Those in favor, 74. Opposed, 102. Abstaining, 2. That item has failed. All right, Mr. Wells with the Legislative and Rules Committee report on item 7.
This resolution to enact an ordinance creating a harbor management commission was presented to us by Assistant Town Attorney Amina Ahmad. She provided us with a historical perspective of the interplay between the special act powers of the town and the state statutes as it relates to jurisdiction and authority over Greenwich harbors. The purpose of this ordinance is to try to retain the special act powers and still be in compliance with the state statute requiring the establishment of a commission. The ordinance also authorizes the Harbor Management Commission to prepare a comprehensive policy document to govern the activities in the harbors.
All right, excuse me. I'd ask those who are conversing to please take their conversations outside, please.
Thank you.
Mr. Wells?
The ordinance also authorizes the Harbor Management Commission to prepare a comprehensive policy document, it's a dangerous word here, to govern the activities in the harbors. If this ordinance is passed, it will allow the town to nominate 3 candidates for harbor master, one of which the governor must select. Without a harbor management committee, the governor is entitled to select who he wants as harbor master. We then turn to the language of the ordinance, and there were some language changes which at the appropriate time I will move to make the changes. Our vote after we made the changes to the language was 11-0 with District 8 absent.
Thank you. Peter Berg with the Land Use Committee report.
Good evening again. We also had Amina Ahmad from the Town Law Department present this item. She went over the history of the Harbor Management Commission proposal, noting that 2 preceding harbor advisory committees had recommended that it be formed. She talked about the state statute that authorizes municipalities to establish harbor management commissions, thereby giving them latitude to develop their own harbor management plans and to propose a list of candidates for the state for the harbor master position. Ms. Ahmad indicated that there would be no additional headcount required and that the Harbor Management Commission would be responsible to the Board of Selectmen and that the RTM would approve appointments to the Harbor Management Commission. Peter Tessie was with us. He noted that the establishment of the Harbor Management Commission is consistent with the Plan of Conservation and Development goals and that it would give Greenwich greater control over its waterway and coastal development. It would also be more efficient to have the Harbor Management Commission rather than having the Board of Selectmen address these issues. Our vote on this item was 11-0-0, District 2 absent.
Thank you. Karen Sadek Khan, Chair of our Parks and Recreation Committee.
First Selectman Peter Tessie was with us to present the item. Our vote was 10-0-0 with Districts 2 and 12 absent. Just some more overview remarks. 16 towns in Connecticut have harbor management commissions. Some of those are Stamford, Norwalk, Fairfield, Milford, Guilford, Stonington, to name a few. Greenwich, as you know, does not have a harbor management commission or a plan. A harbor management commission increases control and authority of harbors to the town to more local control. Some of the actions a harbor management commission would do: look at safety, provide long-range planning, supervise mooring fields, provide review and oversight of structures going into the waters, have 9 members with staggered terms, provide a harbor master replacing the previous harbor master who was a town employee, establish a recognized nonpartisan approach. Members of the commission would be nominated by the Board of Selectmen and appointed by the RTM. The commission would develop a harbor management plan to be approved by the Board of Selectmen and the RTM. Having a plan affords a closer coordination between state and town efforts. In addition, some of the benefits of having a plan will be coordinating and funding of dredging projects, reviewing local issues prior to plans going to the DEEP. And also, this would be responding to the action item from the 2009 POCD that was adopted. Also, it was noted that the harbor master's term would coincide with the governor's term of office. Having a harbor management plan will not impact the town's budget. Again, the vote was 10-0-0. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Wells?
Our committee had received an email from Bernard Schneider concerning language in the first full sentence of page 12, and we adopted his good suggestions. On page 12 of the call, the first full sentence, which begins on the second line, it now reads, "Any and all decisions of the Harbor Management Commission," and goes on from there. Mr. Schneider pointed out that there could be things that would be appealable that might not result from a decision of the Harbor Management Commission, and he suggested the word actions, and we adopted that. So in that second sentence on page 12, we deleted the words decisions and inserted in its place actions. And at the end of that sentence, we deleted the words decision being appealed and inserted in its place Harbor Management Commission's action. So that sentence now reads, "Any and all actions of the Harbor Management Commission may be reviewed or appealed to the Board of Selectmen within 30 days of the Harbor Management Commission's action." In the second full paragraph that begins with "there shall be 2 alternate members," at the end of that paragraph, we deleted the words "as designated by the representative town meeting." And in the last paragraph, there is a sentence that states "a failure of the voting members to attend." It goes on from there. We deleted the word "the," put in its place the word "a," deleted the S in members, and further down where it says "removal of any voting member," so that and we replaced that with the word "such." So it reads, "A failure of a voting member to attend 50% of the regular meetings of the Harbor Management Commission over a 12-month period shall designate evidence of sufficient cause to consider removal of such voting member," and the rest of it remains the same. We made one substantive change at the beginning of that paragraph that begins "attendance at regular meetings by Harbor Management Commission members," also on page 12. We inserted the language, "there shall be at least 1 meeting of the Harbor Management Commission every 3 months." Our vote to include this substantive change was 7-5.
So you are moving to make those amendments?
Yes, sir.
All right. Do we need to go over those? All right. We can adopt amendments upon unanimous consent. If obviously that means there is no objection. Is there any objection to any of those proposed changes? Hearing none and absent objection, the proposed amendments offered on behalf of our Land Use Committee, our Legislative and Rules Committee, are adopted upon unanimous consent. All right. Discussion on item 7 as amended. Will the district chairs please mark your voting cards? Item 7 as amended, and proceed to poll your delegation. I have the result of the vote on item 6, which was the authorization for easements at Old Greenwich train station. Those in favor, 167. Opposed, 3. Abstaining, 1. That item has carried. There being no further business, we will await the result of the pending vote on item 7 before proceeding to adjourn. We have the result of the vote on item 7 as amended. This is the ordinance establishing a harbor management commission. Those in favor, 150. Opposed, 3. Abstaining, 2. That item has carried. There being no further business to come before the meeting, this meeting stands adjourned upon unanimous consent. Thank you all for coming. Have a safe trip home.